When the Final Fantasy VII Remake was released in March 2020, it received instant international acclaim for its high density expansion of the iconic opening sections of the original game. And just the opening sections, but it is an iconic opener, and what Final Fantasy VII is probably most known for, aside from the obvious plot twist. And it's often considered by many to be one of the most important Japanese video role-playing games of all times. So important that, in a series that was at the time solely consisting of one-off single entries, Square Enix returned to the well several times to produce a CGI movie sequel, a portable prequel, several mobile spin-offs, and, as early as 2006, hinted at a full-on high-definition remake. While that may have taken 14 years for this technical demo to transform into Episode 1 of the final game, but the remake was a source of much wonder and irritation amongst fans of the series for that entire time. On the one hand, there was excitement, but on the other, trepidation. And when Episode 1 finally came out, it had so much acclaim for the level of detail it did bring to Midgar. But at the same time, it exposed a new philosophical question. This new game was not just a remake in terms of game design, but a complete reimagining of the world. I'm not a Philistine who believes that everything must always stay the same. Just as movie directors adapt stories from book to film, there will always be some chopping and changing. Story beats compressed, certain scenes cut to help the pacing, some specific character arcs altered to provide a better resolution. As long as it fits with the theming and it complements the work as a whole, I'm often happy with this process. But the Final Fantasy VII Remake, it's not just an adaptation of the original story of Final Fantasy VII, and it's not just extras added onto that story. It is a brand new tale designed to fit around that seminal first work. The more we saw, the more we began to realise that the fundamental structure of the story is different, that vital character backstories have been fundamentally altered, to the result that this Cloud is not the same Cloud that we saw in the original game. It appears that, going forwards, everything is going to change. And this is important, because the original story of Final Fantasy VII was built around themes of loss, grief, and guilt. Every character in the game is carrying some form of guilt and has to come to terms with it. Throughout the game, the innocent pass on, leaving behind the wretched souls who fight on, persisting despite their sorrow. The full extent of the changes in the remake are yet to become apparent, but to all extent and appearances, this can no longer be the case. Which got me thinking about the other entries in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. The other stories built around that original Cloud, the one who walked alone down the hill overlooking Midgar. The last of these that I encountered, the last true original story featuring my Cloud, Barret and Tifa, was the short story compilation On the Way to a Smile, a selection of tales written by Kazushige Nojima, one of the writers from the original game, which was designed to fill the gap between the end of that game on the PlayStation 1 and the CGI sequel movie Advent Children that came out almost a decade later. It features 6 episodes with short interludes from the perspective of the vengeful or loving dead between each chapter. So each chapter or episode explores one character either from the original game or the subsequent movie. It tells their tale, about how they responded to the world-shaking cataclysm that concluded the original Final Fantasy VII, and it does not shy away from the struggles that they face. It is a bleak prequel novel, whose title will only make sense to anyone who then goes on to watch Advent Children and see that the movie ends with Cloud smiling for the very first time in the film. People rave about how cool and intricate Final Fantasy VII was, but they often forget the sense of melancholy that pervades everything within it. Not that people in the book have much to smile about. Denzel, new main character for the first short story, is a particularly tragic character, but a very exciting way to see the events and the repercussions of the original game playing out from an entirely different perspective. To gamers the world over, Cloud, Tifa, Barret, they were heroes, but within their own universe, technically they were terrorists who only narrowly averted their own mistakes and delusions from causing a worldwide catastrophe. The general populace don't know the truth about Professor Gast or Genova. They just saw a giant meteor in the sky and the approaching doomsday. And the rise of the Lifestream, an event depicted with such reverence and hope before, is now a moment of blinding terror and fury as the world lashes out with all of the raw violence that Mother Nature can muster. The rise of the Lifestream was a natural disaster that has blighted the lives of humanity as much as it was necessary for the survival of the planet as a whole. With episode Tifa, the short story settles back on more familiar terrain, but whilst her life after the meteor fall was less instantly tragic than Dunzel's, she was no happier overall. The other aspect that these short stories deconstruct is the loneliness of friends separating and going their separate ways. After the others depart, Tifa is left with Cloud and Marlene as an adopted child, and she's desperate to build a new family with this group. However, for one reason or another, this never quite works out. They're not a real family, not really. And as much as she wants to be there to help Cloud, there's still a disconnect between them that she can't bridge. A gaping void that she wants to fill, wants to step up and help with, but cannot. He maintains that distance. However, the character least well treated by the passing of time probably is Barret. There was always a disconnect in the original game, as the man veered back and forth between the ultimate extremes of rage, humour, and melancholy. A man who had lost his arm in tragic circumstances and had elected to replace it not with a prosthetic limb, but a machine gun. This is an interesting person to try and dissect. Unsatisfied with the homebody normalcy that Cloud and Tifa were striving towards, he abandons his daughter to their care in pursuit of a new goal. Previously he led a bunch of terrorists in a quest to save the world, and he longs for that kind of righteous purpose. In desperation for a new goal, any goal, he nearly betrays everything that I thought he stood for in the original game. He gives voice to the idea that Shinra were right to use Mako energy, that if managed properly the world could have been a better place for them. The Lego quality of the graphics in the original PlayStation Classic, they could never convey the horror of Barret's real story, and images of him shaking his gun fist in rage always looked more comical than terrifying. But this short story does at least show what he looks like to the outside perspectives. He's almost more a monster than a man, a truly dangerous person to be around. He ends up becoming besotted by the quest for oil, which explains his absence for much of the Advent Children movie that followed it. And it did strike me that, potentially, we're showing the trade-off from one form of dangerous enemy production for another. Nothing in life can come free, but global warming is probably the least of this world's problems. That comparison between man and monster is then explored in Nanaki's tale, as the unique guardian beast travels through the wider world on a quest to learn and experience as much of it as he can. Out of a fear that his long life means he's going to inevitably lose those that he cares about, he retreats from the human world, until it then intrudes upon his new home, resulting in a moment of brief, violent tragedy. Nanaki's tale overlaps with Yuffie's as she frantically searches for a cure to the Geostigma that is wrecking the planet. Again, we see that from the layman's perspective, the rise of the Lifestream that appeared as a saviour to those who knew what it represented, it was seen as a curse by those it touched. Yuffie walked home expecting to be hailed a valiant hero, but instead was warned just not to talk about what she'd done, lest the people blame her for spreading the plague. Instead, she turns all of her attention to finding a potential cure, something she has in common with the final episode protagonist, Rufus Shinra. Both of these last two episodes are plot heavy, concerned with a lot of exposition about what the Geostigma is and the way it affects people. It's not that explanations are unwelcome, but after the care and attention put into making each of the scenes in the first few episodes emotionally driven, to suddenly have a driving narrative that trumps raw feelings, it shows that these short stories, they're rushing to lay the scenes for what would follow in Advent Children. But the concept of geostigma, something that the movie never really managed to explore fully, is fascinating. An incurable disease that strikes when you feel dread or loss, that preys upon your fear. This is not a disease, but a malignant will that, once it has you marked, will strike the moment it senses weakness. Once it's infected you, you're going to encounter it sooner or later. On the Way to a Smile is a strange title for a collection that only makes sense for those who watch the movie that follows. It sets the trials that have to be overcome beautifully, and it lays the groundwork for a film that was all about Cloud overcoming his fear and guilt. Only after the stigma is gone, and its underlying cause banished, can Cloud actually let himself be happy. But the movie is another beast, worthy of its own critical analysis. All we have here are brief moments along a journey that repaint the original game in a very different light. I'd recommend reading this for anyone who truly loved that world and doesn't mind seeing it deconstructed by its own makers.